The Greek Way to Western Civilization by Edith Hamilton, Chapter 2, Mind and Spirit. Egypt is a fertile valley of rich river soil. Low-lying, warm, monotonous, a slow-flowing river. And beyond, the limitless desert. Greece is a country of sparse fertility and keen cold winters, all hills and mountains sharp cut in stone, where strong men must work hard to get their bread. And while Egypt submitted and suffered and turned her face toward death, Greece resisted and rejoiced and turned full face to life. For somewhere among those steep stone mountains, in little sheltered valleys, where the great hills were ramparts to defend, and men could have security for peace and happy living, something quite new came into the world. The joy of life found expression. Perhaps it was born there, among the shepherds pasturing their flocks, where the wildflowers made a glory on the hillside, among the sailors on a sapphire sea, washing enchanted islands purple in a luminous air. At any rate, it has left no trace anywhere else in the world of antiquity. In Greece, nothing is more in evidence. The Greeks were the first people in the world to play, and they played on a great scale. Well, there's plenty of evidence that we know of now that all sorts of people did such things. All over Greece, there were games, all sorts of games, athletic contests of every description, races, horse, boat, torch races, contests in music, where one side outsung the other, in dancing on greased skins, sometimes to display a nice skill of foot and balance of body, games where men leaped in and out of flying chariots, games so many one grows weary with the list of them. They are embodied in the statues familiar to all, the disc thrower, the charioteer, the wrestling boys, the dancing flute players, the great games. There were 4 that came at stated seasons, were so important when one was held, a truce of God was proclaimed, so that all Greece might come in safety without fear. There, glorious-limbed youth, the phrase is Pindar's, the athlete's poet, strove for an honor so coveted as hardly anything else in Greece. An Olympic victor, triumphing generals would give place to him. His crown of wild olives was set beside the prize of the tragedian. Splendor attended him, processions, sacrifices, banquets, songs. The greatest poets were glad to write. Thucydides, the brief, the severe, the historian of that bitter time, the fall of Athens, pauses when one of his personages has conquered in the games, to give the fact full place of honor. If we had no other knowledge of what the Greeks were like, if nothing were left of Greek art and culture, literature, the fact that they were in love with play and played magnificently would be proof enough of how they lived and how they looked at life. Wretched people, toiling people, do not play. Nothing like the Greek games is conceivable in Egypt or Mesopotamia. Well, they had board games, but they did have chariots and that sort of stuff. The life of the Egyptian lies spread out in the mural paintings down to the minutest detail. If fun and sport had played any real part, they would be there in some form for us to see. But Egyptians did not play. Salome, Salome, you Greeks are all children, said the Egyptian priest to the great Athenian. At any rate, children or not, they enjoyed themselves. They had physical vigor and high spirits and time, too, for fun. The witness of the games is conclusive, and when Greece died, and her reading of the great enigma was buried with her statues, play too died out of the world. The brutal, bloody Roman games had nothing to do with the spirit of play. They were fathered by the Orient, not by Greece. Play died when Greece died, and many a century passed before it was resurrected. To rejoice in life, to find the world beautiful and delightful to live in, was a mark of the Greek spirit which distinguished it from all that had gone before. It is a vital distinction. The joy of life is written upon everything that the Greeks left behind, and they who leave it out of account fail to reckon with something that is of first importance in understanding how the Greek achievement came to pass in the world of antiquity. It is not a fact that jumps to the eye for the reason that their literature is marked as strongly by sorrow. The Greeks knew to the full how bitter life is, as well as how sweet. Joy and sorrow, exultation and tragedy stand hand in hand in Greek literature, but there is no contradiction involved thereby. Those who do not know the one do not really know the other either. It is the depressed, the gray-minded people who cannot rejoice just as they cannot agonize. The Greeks were not the victims of depression. Greek literature is not done in gray or with a low palette. Greek literature, it is all black and shining, white or black, and scarlet and gold. The Greeks were keenly aware, terribly aware, of life's uncertainty and the imminence of death. Over and over again they emphasize the brevity and the failure of all human endeavor, the swift passing of all that is beautiful and joyful. To Pindar, even as he glorifies the victor in the games, life is a shadow's dream. But never, not in their darkest moments, do they lose their taste for life. It is always a wonder and a delight. The world a place of beauty, and they themselves rejoicing to be alive in it. Quotations to illustrate this attitude are so numerous, it is hard to make a choice. One might quote all the Greek poems there are, even when they are tragedies. Every one of them shows the fire of life burning high. Never a Greek poet that did not warm both hands at that flame. Often in the midst of a tragedy, a choral song of joy breaks forth. So Sophocles, of the three tragedians, the soberest, the most severe, sings in the Antigone of the wine god. Well, remember the text about Bacchus. One of them was slightly altered into the Gospel of John. With whom the stars rejoice as they move. The stars whose breath is fire are an Ajax. That's not the Greek. I don't remember the Greek pronunciation of some of these things because I don't have the characters here before me. Were thrilling with rapture, soaring on wings of sudden joy, he calls to Pan. O Pan, come, sea rover, down from the snow-beaten mountain crag, Lord of the dance, the gods delight in. Come, for now, I too would dance, O joy. Are in the Oedipus Colonius, where tragedy is suddenly put aside by the poet's love of the out-of-door world, of the nightingale's clear, thrilling note, and the stainless tide of pure waters, and the glory of the narcissus and the bright shining crocus, which the choir of the muses love, and Aphrodite of the golden rain. Passages like these come again and again, lifting the black curtain of tragedy to the full joy of life. They are no artifice or trick to heighten by contrast. They are the natural expression of men who were tragedians indeed, but Greeks first. And so thrillingly aware of the wonder and beauty of life, they could not but give it place. The little pleasures, too, that daily living holds, were felt as such keen enjoyment, dear to us ever. Says Homer, is the banquet, and the harp, and the dance, and changes of raiment, and the warm bath, and love and sleep, eating and drinking, have never again seemed so delightful as in the early Greek lyrics, nor a meeting with friends, nor a warm fire of a winter's night, the stormy season of winter, a soft couch after dinner by the fire, honey-sweet wine in your glass, and nuts and beans at your elbow, nor a run in the springtime, amid a fragrance of woodbine and leisure and white poplar, when the plane tree and the elm whisper together, nor a banqueting hour, moving among feasting and giving up the soul to be young, carrying a bright harp and touching it in peace among the wise of the citizens. It is a matter of course that comedy should be their invention, the mad, rollicking, irresponsible fun of the old comedy, its verve and vitality and exuberant, overflowing energy of life, a tomb in Egypt and a theater in Greece. The one comes to mind as naturally as the other. So was the world changing by the time the 5th century before Christ began in Athens. The exercise of vital powers along lines of excellence in a life affording them scope is an old Greek definition of happiness. It is a conception permeated with energy of life. Through all Greek history, that spirit of life aboundingly moves. It led along many an untried way. Authoritarianism and submissiveness were not the direction it pointed to. A high-spirited people full of physical vigor do not obey easily, and indeed the strong air of the mountains has never been wholesome for despots. The absolute monarch, submissive slave theory of life flourishes best where there are no hills to give a rebel refuge and no mountain heights to summon a man to live dangerously. I don't think you can define that to that sort of thing, but polytheism is less common in those circumstances. Well, at least polytheism that doesn't tend towards monotheism. Because Christianity is monotheistic, but it's not monotheism. When history begins in Greece, there is no trace of the ancient state. The awful, unapproachable, sacred potentate, Pharaoh of Egypt, priest-king of Mesopotamia, whose absolute power none had questioned for thousands of years, is nowhere in the scene. There is nothing that remotely resembles him in Greece. Something we know of the age of the tyrants in Greek history, but what we know most clearly is that it was put a stop to. Abject submission to the power on the throne, which had been the rule of life in the ancient world since kings began. Now we kind of just pretend that that's not what's going on with our politicians who really serve other individuals, and was to be the rule of life in Asia for centuries to come, was cast off by the Greeks so easily, so lightly, hardly more than an echo of the contest has come down to us. In the Persians of Aeschylus, a play written to celebrate the defeat of the Persians at Salamis, there is many an allusion to the difference between the Greek way and the Oriental way. The Greeks, the Persian queen is told, fight as free men to defend what's precious to them. Have they no master? She asks. No, she is told. No man calls Greeks slaves or vassals. Herodotus, in his account, adds, they obey only the law. Something completely new is here. The idea of freedom has been born. The conception of the entire unimportance of the individual to the state, which had persisted down from earliest tribal days and was universally accepted in all the ancient world, has given place in Greece to the conception of the liberty of the individual in a state which he defends of his own free will. That is a change not worked by high spirit and abounding vigor alone. Something more was at work in Greece. Men were thinking for themselves. One of the earlier Greek philosophic sayings is that of Anaxagoras. All things were in chaos when mind arose and made order. In the ancient world, ruled by the irrational, by dreadful unknown powers, where a man was utterly at the mercy of what he must not try to understand. The Greeks arose, and the rule of reason began. The fundamental fact about the Greek was that he had to use his mind. The ancient priests had said, thus far and no farther. We set the limits to thought. The Greek said, all things are to be examined and called into question. There are no limits set to thought. It is an extraordinary fact that by the time we have actual documentary knowledge of the Greeks, there is not a trace to be found of that domination over the mind by the priests which played such a decisive part in the ancient world. The priest plays no real part in either the history or the literature of Greece. In the Iliad, he orders a captive taken back to appease an angry god and stop a pestilence, and is given a grudging obedience with the backing of the pestilence, but that is his sole appearance on the scene. The Trojan War is fought out by gods and men with no intermediaries. A prophet or two appears in the tragedies, but for evil oftener than for good. Well, there's prophets for different sides, right? In the Agamemnon of Aeschylus, 100 years before Plato, there is a criticism of the dark powers exercised by the ministers of religion, which goes with precision to the heart of the matter. And truly, what of good ever have prophets brought to men? Craft of many worlds only through evil your message speaks. Seers bring a terror, so to keep men afraid. Well, there was obviously also people who falsely claimed to be so spiritually gifted too. The conclusion might be drawn from the words that something of that sort of power was in fact wielded then by priest and prophet. But what is certainly true is that the poet who spoke them to a great audience, with the most important priests sitting in the front row seats, won for himself not disapproval, but the highest mark of favor the people could give. There is nothing clearer and nothing more astonishing than the strict limits the Greek set to the power of the priests. Priests in numbers there were, and altars in temples, and at a time of public danger, disrespect shown to the forms of religion would arouse, even in Athens, superstition and popular fury. But the place of the priest in Greece was in the background. The temple was his and the temple rites, and nothing else. The Greek kept his formal religion in one compartment and everything that really mattered to him in another. He never went to a priest for guidance or advice. Did he want to know how to bring up his children or what truth was? He went to Socrates, or to the great sophist Protagoras or to a learned grammarian. The idea of consulting a priest would never have occurred to him. The priests could tell him the proper times and the proper forms for sacrifices. That was their business, and only that. In the laws written in Plato's old age, and on the whole in a spirit of reaction against his earlier revolts, the entire subject of religion is discussed without a single reference to a priest. Well, because religion is beyond some professional that you put in between you and deity, or what you consider to be gods. The laws, it should perhaps be pointed out, is not written for the ideal state, the heavenly pattern of the republic, but is addressed to the ideas and feelings of the Greeks of that day. The Athenian, who is the chief speaker, often meets with criticism from the other two personages of the dialogue when he proposes an innovation, but they accept without a word of surprise or dissent a statement that those who talk loosely about the gods and sacrifices and oracles should be admonished by members of the governing council. These are to converse with them touching the improvement of their soul's health. There is not a suggestion from any of the three that a priest might be of use here. Furthermore, before a man is prosecuted for impiety, the guardians of the law shall determine if the deed has been done in earnest or only from childish levity. It was clearly not the idea that in matters touching the life and liberty of a Greek citizen, the priest should have a voice. At the end of the argument, the priest's proper domain is briefly indicated. When a man is disposed to sacrifice, let him place his offerings in the hands of the priests and priestesses, who have under their care the holy rite. And that is the sum total of what the speakers hold to be the priest's part in religion. And he has no part in anything except religion. Even more noteworthy, as illustrating the Greek point of view, is the Athenians' characterization as monstrous natures of those who say they can conjure the dead and bribe the gods with sacrifices and prayers. In other words, those who used magic and tried to obtain favors from heaven by practices not unknown and in the most civilized lands today. No doubt the oracles at Delphi, notably, played a prominent role in Greece, but none of the oracular sayings that have come down to us bear the familiar priestly stamp. Athens, seeking guidance from the Delphic priestess at the time of the Persian invasion, is not told to sacrifice hecatombs to the god and offer precious treasure to the oracle, but merely to defend herself with wooden walls, a piece of acute worldly wisdom, at least as interpreted by Themistocles when Croesus, the rich, the king of Lydia, sent to Delphi to find out if he would succeed in a war against Persia, and paved his way by magnificent gifts. Any priests in the world, except the Greeks, would have made their profit for their church by an intimation that the costlier the offering, the surer his success. But the only answer the Greek Holy of Holies gave him was that by going to war he would destroy a great empire. It happened to be his own, but, as the priestess pointed out, she was not responsible for his lack of wit, and certainly there was no intimation that if he had given more, things would have turned out better. The sentences which Plato says were inscribed in the shrine at Delphi are singularly unlike those to be found in holy places outside of Greece. Know thyself was the first, and nothing in excess the second, both marked by a total absence of the idiom of priestly formulas all the world over. Something new was moving in the world, the most disturbing force there is. All things are at odds. When God lets a thinker loose on this planet, they were let loose in Greece. The Greeks were intellectualists. They had a passion for using their minds. The fact shines through even their use of language. Our word for school comes from the Greek word for leisure. Of course, reasoned the Greek, given leisure, a man will employ it in thinking and finding out about things. Leisure and the pursuit of knowledge, the connection was inevitable to a Greek. In our ears, philosophy has an austere, if not a dreary sound. The word is Greek, but it had not that sound in the original. The Greeks meant by it the endeavor to understand everything there is. And they called it what they felt it to be, the love of knowledge. How charming is divine philosophy? Well, technically, divine philosophy would be in the religious context, now wouldn't it? In the world of antiquity, those who practiced the healing art were magicians, priests versed in special magic rites. The Greeks called their healers physicians, which means those versed in the ways of nature. Here, in brief, is an exemplification of the whole trend of the Greek mind. Its swing away from antiquity and toward modernity. To be versed in the ways of nature means that a man has observed outside facts and reasoned about them. He has used his powers not to escape from the world, but to think himself more deeply into it. To the Greeks, the outside world was real and something more. It was interesting. They looked at it attentively, and their minds worked upon what they saw. This is essentially the scientific method. The Greeks were the first scientists, and all science goes back to them. In nearly every field of thought, they took the first indispensable steps. The statement means more than is apparent on the surface. The reason that antiquity did not give birth to science was not only because fact tended to grow more and more unreal and unimportant. I don't think we can quite make that point, but there was an even more cogent cause. The ancient world was a place of fear. Magical forces ruled it, and magic is absolutely terrifying because it is absolutely incalculable. The minds of those who might have been scientists had been held fast bound in the prison of that terror. Nothing of all the Greeks did is more astonishing than their daring to look it in the face and use their minds about it. They dared nothing else than to throw the light of reason upon dreadful powers, taken completely on trust everywhere else, and by the exercise of the intelligence to banish them. Well, the banishing them was the difference with the Greek world and the Islamic world. The Islamic world was motivated to look into the sciences and to use the scientific technology and stuff because of religion. They didn't separate the things, but they did realize that a lot of these superstitions and stuff were not, they turned against the gypton to goot, so they did that in their own way too. Galileo, the humanists of the Renaissance, are glorified for their courage in venturing beyond the limits set by a power that could damn their souls eternally, and in demanding to know for themselves what the universe was like. No doubt it was high courage, great and admirable, but it was altogether beneath that shown by the Greeks. The humanists ventured upon the fearful ocean of free thought under guidance. The Greeks had preceded them there. They chanced that great adventure all alone. High spirit and the energy of great vital powers had worked in them to assert themselves against despotic rule, and had refused to submit to priestly rule. They would have no man to dictate to them, and being free from masters, they used their freedom to think. For the first time in the world, the mind was free as it hardly is today. Both the state and religion left the Athenian free to think as he pleased. During World War I, a play would have had short shrift here which showed up General Pershing for a coward, ridiculed the Allies' cause, brought in Uncle Sam as a blustering bully, glorified the peace party. But when Athens was fighting for her life, Aristophanes did the exact equivalent of all these things many times over, and the Athenians, pro and anti-war alike, flocked to the theater. The right of a man to say what he pleased was fundamental in Athens. A slave is he who cannot speak his thought, said Euripides. Socrates, drinking the hemlock in his prison on the charge of introducing new gods and corrupting the youth, is but the exception that proves the rule. He was an old man, and all his life he had said what he would. Athens had just gone through a bitter time of crushing defeat, of rapid changes of government, of gross mismanagement. It is a reasonable conjecture that he was condemned in one of those sudden panics all nations know, when the people's fears for their own safety have been worked upon, and they turn cruel. Even so, he was condemned by a small majority, and his pupil, Plato, went straight on teaching in his name, never molested, but honored and sought after. Socrates was the only man in Athens who suffered death for his opinions. 3 others were forced to leave the country. That is the entire list, and to compare it with the endless list of those tortured and killed in Europe during even the last 500 years is to see clearly what Athenian liberty was. The Greek mind was free to think about the world as it pleased, to reject all traditional explanations, to disregard all the priests taught, to search unhampered by any outside authority for the truth. The Greeks had free scope for their scientific genius, and they laid the foundations of our science today. Homer's hero, who cried for more light, even if it were but light to die in, was a true Greek. They could never leave anything obscure, neither could they leave anything unrelated. System, order, connection, they were impelled to seek for. An unanalyzed whole was an impossible conception for them. Their very poetry is built on clarity of ideas, with plan and logical sequence. Great artists though they would never give over trying to understand beauty as well as to express it. Plato is speaking as a typical Greek when he says that there are men who have an intuitive insight, an inspiration which causes them to do good and beautiful things. They themselves do not know why they do as they do, and therefore they are unable to explain to others. It is so with poets, and in a sense with all good men. But if one could be found who was able to add to his instinct for the right or the beautiful a clear idea of the reason for its rightness or beauty, he would be among men. What a living man would be in the dead world of flitting shades. That statement is completely Greek in its conception of values. There never were people farther from the idea of the contemplation of beauty as a rest to the mind. They were not in the world to find rest for their mind in anything. They must analyze and reflect upon everything. Any general term they found themselves using must be precisely realized, and the language of all philosophy is their creation. But to leave the intellectuality of the Greeks here would be to give only half of the picture. Even in Greece, science and philosophy wore a sober look. But the Greeks did not think soberly about the exercise of the intellect. Thoughts and ideas, the fair and immortal children of the mind, as a Greek writer calls them, were a delight to them. Never, not in the brightest days of the Renaissance, has learning appeared in such a radiant light as it did to the gay young men. Joyous. People weren't as homosexual in Greece as people like to think. To the gay young men of the imperial Athens. Listen to one of them talking to Socrates, just walked up in the early dawn by a persistent hammering at his door. "What's here?" he cries out, still half asleep. "Oh, Socrates!" And the voice is that of a lad he knows well. "Good news, good news. It ought to be at this unearthly hour. Well, out with it. The young fellow is in the house now. Oh, Socrates, Protagoras has come. I heard it yesterday evening, and I was going to you at once, but it was so late." "What's it all about?" "Protagoras. Has he stolen something of yours?" The boy bursts out laughing. Yes, that's just it. He's robbing me of wisdom. He has it, wisdom, and he can give it to me. Oh, come and go with me to him. Start now." That eager, delightful boy in love with learning can be duplicated in nearly every dialogue of Plato. Socrates has but to enter a gymnasium, exercise, games are forgotten. A crowd of ardent young men surround him. "Tell us this, teach us that," they clamor. "What is friendship? What is justice?" "We will not let you off, Socrates." "The truth. We want the truth." "What delight," they say to each other, "to hear wise men talk." Egypt and Phoenicia love money. Plato remarks in a discussion of how nations differ. The special characteristic of our part of the world is the love of knowledge. The Athenians, said St. Luke, and the strangers sojourning there spend their time in nothing else but to tell or hear of some new thing. Even the foreigners caught the flame, that intense desire to know, that burning curiosity about everything in the world. They could not come into daily contact with it and not be fired up. And down the coast of Asia Minor, St. Paul was mobbed and imprisoned and beaten. In Athens, they brought him into the Areopagus, saying, "May we know what this new teaching is." Now, in what's called the New Testament, the Pauline position in a couple passages, and you don't really see conflict, is against philosophy. But basically they were closing it to anybody else because pre-Socratic, Socratic, Platonic, Aristotelian philosophy, you definitely see that. Hedonism, Epicureanism is a specific form of hedonism. You do find that promoted in the Bible, you could say. And a lot of people don't know what hedonism is, but you're looking at the consequences. In Epicureanism, you look at the consequences in terms of pain and pleasure, and it's a promotion towards learning. But Aristotle, the model scientist, the man of cool head and detached observation, unbiased, impersonal, does not display any dispassionate aloofness in his consideration of reason. He so loves it and delights in it that when it is the theme of discourse, he cannot be held within the sober bounds of the scientific spirit. His words must be quoted, they are so characteristically Greek. Since then, reason is divine in comparison with man's whole nature. The life, according to reason, must be divine in comparison with usual human life. Nor ought we to pay regard to those who exhort us that as men we ought to think human things and keep our eyes upon mortality. Nay, as far as may be, we should endeavor to rise to that which is immortal and live in conformity with that which is best in us. Now what is characteristic of any nature is that which is best for it and gives most joy. Such to man is the life according to reason, since it is this that makes him man. Love of reason and of life, delight in the use of the mind and body, distinguished the Greek way, the Egyptian way, and the way of the East, had led through suffering and by the abnegation of the intellect to the supremacy of the spirit. That goal the Greeks could never come within sight of. Their own nature and the conditions of their life alike shut them off from it, but they knew the way of the spirit no less. The all-sufficing proof that the world of the spirit was where the flame of their genius burned highest is their art. Indeed, their intellectuality has been obscured to us precisely by virtue of that transcendent achievement. Greece means Greek art to us, and that is a field in which the reason does not rule. The extraordinary flowering of the human spirit which resulted in Greek art shows the spiritual power there was in Greece. What marked the Greeks off from Egypt and India was not an inferior degree of spirituality, but a superior degree of mentality. Great mind and great spirit combined in them. The spiritual world was not to them another world from the natural world. It was the same world as that known to the mind. Beauty and rationality were both manifested in it. They did not see the conclusions reached by the spirit and those reached by the mind as opposed to each other. Reason and feeling were not antagonistic. The truth of poetry and the truth of science were both true. It is difficult to illustrate this conception of reality by isolated quotations, but the attitude of the greatest of Greek scientists may serve as an example. Aristotle was in one sense the typical scientist, a man endowed with extraordinary powers of observation and of reasoning upon his data, preoccupied with what he could see and what he could know. Anywhere else and at any other time he would have been the man of pure reason, viewing with condescension, if not contempt, conclusions reached in any way except that of the mind. But to Aristotle, the Greek, the way of the spirit was also important, and the scientific method sometimes to be abandoned in favor of the poetic method. In his well-known statement in the Poetics that poetry has a higher truth than history since it expresses truth of general application, whereas that of history is partial and limited, he is not speaking as a scientist, nor would the statement commend itself to the scientific mind outside of Greece. There is no evidence, again, of the scientist's point of view in the great passage where he sets forth the reason for the work of his life, his search into the nature of all living things. The glory, doubtless, of the heavenly bodies fills us with more delight than the contemplation of these lowly things, but the heavens are high and far off, and the knowledge of celestial things that our senses give us is scanty and dim. Living creatures, on the contrary, are at our door, and if we so desire, we may gain full and certain knowledge of each and all. We take pleasure in a statue's beauty. Should not then the living fill us with delight? And all the more if in the spirit of the love of knowledge we search for causes and bring to light evidences of meaning, then will nature's purpose and her deep-seated laws be revealed in all things, all tending in her multitudinous work to one form or another of the beautiful. Did ever scientist outside of Greece so state the object of scientific research? To Aristotle, being a Greek, it was apparent that the full purpose of that high enterprise could not be expressed in any way except the way of poetry, and being a Greek, he was able to express it. Spirituality inevitably brings to our mind religion. Greek religion is known to us chiefly or only as a collection of fairy tales, by no means always edifying. This is to belie the immense hold the Greeks had on things spiritual. It would have been impossible for the nation that produced the art and the poetry of Greece to have a permanently superficial view of religion, just as it would have been impossible for them not to use their minds on Homer's gods and goddesses, those charming stories which came down from a time when men had a first-hand knowledge of nature, now forever lost, were never, it is true, anathematized with book and bell and public recantation. That was not the Greek way. They loved them, and their fancy played with them, but they found their way through them to what underlies all religion, east or west. Aeschylus will speak like a prophet of Israel, and the Zeus he praises, Isaiah would have understood. Father, Creator, mighty God, great craftsman, with his hand he fashioned man, ancient in wisdom, working through all things, in a safe harbor, guiding all at last, words left out, with whom the deed and word are one, to execute with swiftness all the ends, conceived in the deep counsels of his mind. Now, some things have metaphorical senses or other literal senses. Like in tonic, you don't have God the Father. So in what they call the Old Testament, you don't literally have God the Father. You have God the provider, God the center of the family, the center, etc., etc. But the Greeks definitely did have literal reference to divine family, But again, a person could use that language without meaning it literally. Ye men of Athens, said St. Paul on the Areopagus, I perceive that in all things you're too superstitious. So the Bible version runs, but the last word could quite as accurately be translated in dread of the divine power, meaning borne out by the reason St. Paul gives for his use of it. For as I passed by and beheld your devotions, I found an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God. The words carry us far away from the gay company of the Olympians. The joyous company. They go back to the poet who had written, through thick and shadowed forests stretch the pathways of his purpose, beyond our power to search out. That altar to the unknown God, who is past our power to search out, could have been raised only by men who had gone beneath the pleasant surface of comfortable orthodoxies and easy certainties. A single sentence of Socrates, spoken when he was condemned to death, shows how the Greek could use his mind upon religion, and by means of human wisdom joined to spiritual insight, could sweep aside all the superficialities and see through to the thing that is ultimate in religion. Think this certain, that to a good man no evil can happen, either in life or in death. These words are the final expression of faith. There is a passage in Socrates' last talk with his friends before his death, which exemplifies with perfect fidelity that control of the feelings by the reason, and that balance between the spirit and the mind which belong to the Greek. It is the last hour of his life, and his friends who have come to be with him to the end have turned the talk upon the immortality of the soul. In such a moment, it would be natural to seek only for comfort and support, and let calm judgment and cool reason loosen their hold. The Greek and Socrates could not do that. His words are, at this moment I am sensible that I have not the temper of a seeker after knowledge, like the vulgar. I am only a partisan, for the partisan, when he is engaged in a dispute, cares nothing about the rights of the question, but is anxious only to convince his hearers. And the difference between him and me at the present moment is only this, that while he seeks to convince his hearers that what he says is true, I am seeking to convince myself. To convince my hearers is a second matter with me, and do but see how much I have to gain by this. For if what I say is true, then I do well to believe it, and if there be nothing after death, still I shall save my friends from grief during the short time that is left me, and my ignorance will do me no harm. This is the state of mind in which I approach the argument, and I would ask you to be thinking of the truth and not of Socrates. Agree with me if I seem to you to speak the truth, or if not, withstand me, might and main, that I may not deceive you as well as myself in my desire, and like the bee, leave my sting in you before I die. Now let us proceed. There is a theme that comes up in the Quran repeatedly that's analogous to this, is that the prophet figure wants to make sure that the path is continued regardless of their life. It's not about them. Socrates, the pursuit of knowledge is not, just because you like Socrates.